Good morning and welcome today. As Corey said, my name's Jeff Ringer. I'm the director of the center, and I have a sort of mixed feelings today. On the one hand, I'm incredibly proud to welcome back Gordon Flake. He is among our most distinguished alums and fitting of this award. On the other hand, I was Gordon's teacher, and so I'm not sure whether I'm feeling proud or simply old today to welcome him back. His career is an example of the kinds of activities that we hope graduates of the Kennedy Center will pursue, making a difference in the world, making the world a better place to live. He is a great friend of the center, a great friend of mine personally, and we're really honored to have him here today. And I want to turn it over to Professor Larson to provide you a little fuller description of Gordon's background before he speaks.
Good morning. It is indeed both an institutional and a personal pleasure to introduce Gordon Flake as our distinguished alumni. Yes, he is an alumni. He did his undergraduate BA degree here at BYU and then an MA here in the Kennedy Center. And he certainly is distinguished. If you've taken a look at his career, most of it has been spent in Washington, D.C., working for institutions whose primary purpose is to increase our understanding of and analysis of international affairs, of relations between the United States and other parts of the world, particularly Asia. This includes stints at the Korea Economic Institute of America, the Atlantic Council of the United States, and then most recently, for the longest period of time, the Mansfield Foundation. Though when you got on board, it was the Mansfield Center for Pacific Affairs, and it's changed names a few times, but same institution, and devoted to increasing our understanding of again, relations in general, but particularly of Asia. Gordon has written countless op-eds, analyses, articles, book chapters on various aspects of Northeast Asia. He's also co-edited a number of books. The simple publication output is astounding. He's also been tapped as an expert by both the United States Congress, in front of which he's testified as an expert, but also by virtually any media outlet you can think of, whether it's in the United States or abroad. At one point or another, they have interviewed, they have quoted, they have featured Gordon Flake. On a more personal note, Gordon and I have interacted in a number of interesting ways in our lives. We first interacted as opponents in a high school debate tournament back in the Stone Age, before there were things like CDs and cell phones and things like that. We were missionaries in Korea at the same time. We were undergrads here together, and then I spent a number of years in Washington, D.C., was able to see him in action in sort of his home terrain. And I can say with great confidence that whether you're talking about the mountains of Montana or the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., whether you're talking about Tokyo or Beijing or Seoul or even Pyongyang, you will find Gordon Flake there giving very informed, incisive commentary and analysis. And so I can't think of a better honored alumni to introduce than Gordon Flake. So without further ado.
Well, thank you. Kirk was very gracious in his introduction. What he failed to tell you is in that very early debate contest, he cleaned the floor with me. And so, and I've been following him ever since, so I'm honored to be here today. While I am delighted to be here at the Kennedy Center, I must be honest that I'm a little bit bewildered by the notion of an Alumni Achievement Award. I'm probably a little bit too literal in this, but I also assumed achievement is an action, something you've done. And as I look back on my career, I kind of have a hard time kind of identifying what is it I've actually purported to have achieved in that regard. If you ask my daughter who's sitting here or my other children what their father does for work, they will probably tell you, well, he talks a lot and he has a lot of meetings, which is the best explanation I can give. Regardless, however, I am truly honored to be here. I'm honored by this award, the award and my affiliation with the Kennedy Center. Lately, I've been giving a lot of thought to a sense of place. Just a month ago, my wife and I had a chance to travel to my hometown in Arizona. I was born and raised on the Navajo Indian Reservation, the Navajo Nation there. And just passing by the old chapel where I grew up, I was almost overcome by emotions. In this little chapel, that's where I really gained my testimony. It's where I passed the sacrament for the first time. It's where I was baptized. It's where I was ordained to the priesthood. I left for my mission from there. And so every time I go by there, there's this intense sense of place. And it's my spiritual home in that regard. BYU is the same way. The mountains, the campus, the Kennedy Center here where, again, I remember sitting around so many hours of meetings around this old war table they used to have, this great big old round table where we learned so much, where my intellectual horizons were expanded tremendously. I can still remember the exact staircase in the Harris Fine Arts Center where I fell in love with my wife for the first time. So BYU, likewise, has a sense of place for me. And I'm honored to be back here. If I do have an achievement, it's that somehow over the last 2 decades, I've connived to manufacture excuses to come back to BYU almost on an annual basis. And the Kennedy Center has been very gracious to let me prattle on about Korea or Japan or other Asia issues that we've been working on. If you'll indulge me a little bit further before I go into the substance of my remarks, I'd like to give particular acknowledgement to two Davids in my life. First and foremost to my father, David K. Flake, who's with us here, and then secondly to David M. Kennedy, whose name the center bears and whose picture is on there on the wall. First and foremost, of course, is my father. Together with my mother, who I really appreciate both coming up here for this, they've always been so supportive, encouraging for me throughout my life, and I couldn't be here without them. My father really remains to me to be my great example, my spiritual mentor, my lodestar in every way. What he probably doesn't remember is that long before I had anything to do with Asia, I was in high school and I was reading a novel, historical novel set in the warlord era of China. And I came home to my dad because I wasn't understanding what was going on. And my father, both my parents are BYU alums as well, but my father went on to get a master's degree here. It never occurred to me that he wouldn't know anything because he knew everything. And he laid out to me in great detail what had happened with Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists in Taiwan. And so I always thought he knew everything. Despite some of our disagreements politically lately, that perception persists as we go forward. The second David I should mention is David M. Kennedy. When I was a freshman here at BYU, I happened to be roommates with a young man who proposed to and eventually married David M. Kennedy's granddaughter. So at the time, I was a secondary ed major. I wanted to be a teacher like my father. I was interested in international affairs, but I hadn't yet served my mission. And as being part of this wedding party with my roommate, I actually got set at a luncheon roundtable right next to David M. Kennedy. And he extolled, the wonders of foreign policy. And he, if you recall, he'd been ambassador to NATO and ambassador at large. And I just came away from that just so excited about majoring in international relations and having a career in kind of foreign affairs. And so I owe a tremendous debt of gratitude not only to Jeff and Corey and Kirk and the others that here are the staff at the center and the center itself, but also to David M. Kennedy. So with that, let me turn, if I could, to the topic that I've decided to address very briefly today with the hopes that we could have more of an open discussion and answer when I've wrapped it up. And the topic was 2012 political transition in Northeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula. Now, as some of you may know, I served a mission in South Korea and again, focused on Korea, got an undergraduate degree in Korean language here. And there's one advantage to being a Korea specialist. Korea, as those of you who know Northeast Asia, is relatively small between the bigger countries of China and Japan. And if you're a Korea specialist, you basically have to understand the regional dynamic. If you're a Japan specialist, Japan is big. There's an awful lot going on there in academic circles or even in policy circles. You could just spend your entire life working on Japan issues. And likewise, if you're a China specialist, there's enough there that provides meat for for you to work on for your entire career. But if you're a Korea specialist, you really can't understand history or contemporary relations without understanding what's happening in China, what's happening in Japan, what's happening in the United States, the region writ large. And that has actually proved to be a tremendous benefit for me as I've gone through my career. A year ago, in August, I was in Sweden. In addition to my children's 2 count of talking a lot and going to a lot of meetings, I travel a lot as well. That's probably the third part of my job they didn't mention. And the real scam of the field that I work in the think tank nonprofit sector, is a lot of the travel is in good weather and good places. That's how they entice us to come. And so in August of last year, I was in Sweden for an organization or a conference organized by the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, the Korean think tank, and the FOIA, F-O-I, the Swedish Defense Agency. And they were looking at political change in Northeast Asia in 2012. Now, with apologies to my Uncle Garth, who's a Mayan specialist or knows these things better than I am, the political calendar in 2012 for Northeast Asia was actually more cataclysmic than the political calendar of that famed Mayan 2012 political calendar we thought that was the end of the world, right? Just to give you an idea, you had political changes in Russia, in China, in Taiwan, in South Korea, in the United States, presumably in Japan, because Japan changes leaders quite often, right? And anticipated, but actually realized, in North Korea. So all of a sudden, in 1 year, in one fell swoop, you had changes in government, either through elections or leadership transition in the entire region. And that's interesting enough in its impact on Korea that I thought what I would do today is just kind of walk you through the last year. Some of these have taken place. Some of them have not yet taken place. Talk about their impact on Korea today, and then kind of wrap up there if I could. I'll begin with looking at these countries kind of in order of relevance to Korea. And so I'll start with Russia. Russia, despite certain candidates who will remain unnamed in a lecture here at BYU, claiming that Russia is our #1 geopolitical foe in the world today. In Asia, that's not necessarily true. Russia really is not much of a player. Their impact on the Korean Peninsula is nothing compared to what it was in the 1950s or before that. They are both in terms of their capacity and their intent, their ability to really influence. They want to be at the table, but they're really not a player in a serious way in Northeast Asia today. And if you look at the political transition that took place in Russia, they had a March election, but it was an election where you went from Putin to Medvedev to back to Putin. And so in many respects, it really wasn't a political transition at all, right? It's just a little bit of musical chairs among the same guys. And so as a result, in terms of the impact of elections or political transition in Russia on Korea, it's the country that probably had the least. Yeah? It's interesting, we noted it, but there really hasn't been a dramatic change in policy or actions in terms of Russia's part. So moving on, the second country, probably by orders of increasing relevance to Korea, is Taiwan. Taiwan had a presidential election on January 14th of this year, a contest between Ma Ying-jeou with the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, and Tsai Ing-wen with the Democratic Party, the PPP. That was an election, when we looked at it back last year, which had the potential to really kind of shake up the region. In other words, if Tsai Ing-wen had won, and a much more independence-minded, distance from Beijing party had won-minded, there really could have been a real regional instability in cross-strait relations, in relations between China and Taiwan that would have had spillover effects to Korea and the region at large. But that didn't happen. Mao was the candidate that the Chinese wanted, that they were comfortable with. His re-election basically assured that the situation remained stable. And as a result, again, relatively, it had not too much direct impact on Korea. So we're checking off 2 transitions as it goes. The third is Japan. Japan is a country, I think most of you know, that has seen 6 prime ministers in 6 years and is so caught up and tied up in their own domestic internal problems. The presumption was that Japan really had very little to do with Korea. But in the last 2 months alone, there have been several developments in Japan that have really made Japan much more of an issue than it would have been otherwise. Obviously, Japan is first and foremost focused on rebuilding after the horrible events of March 11th, 2011, the tsunami, the nuclear disaster, et cetera. And they've got their own domestic internal political problems that are driving a lot of their lack of a role in the region writ large. But without trying to identify who or where or when it started, I noticed on the Kennedy Center map outside in this wonderful campus where there's no graffiti, there is this little part of the map where it says East Sea or Sea of Japan, where it looks like it's been marked out and remarked out and crossed over and again. There is this contest that goes on between Korea and Japan, dealing with historical legacy issues, dealing not only with the naming of that sea, but dealing with a small islet called Dokdo, that the Japanese call Takashima, which has really kind of flared up in recent months. In August, the South Korean President Lee Myung-bak visited, which has really angered the Japanese, who also claim sovereignty of the islands. Just this last week, the Japanese and the Koreans severed their currency swap agreement, which is more symbolic than anything else, but it gives you an idea of how things have kind of gone quite south in that relationship. But partly as a result of this, as a result of these sensitive issues and similar territorial disputes that Japan has with China over the Senkaku Islands, or what the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands, right? All of a sudden, Japan is there's some interesting developments happening within Japan. There was an election for the presidency of the Liberal Democratic Party, not the ruling Democratic Party of Japan, the DPJ, but the opposition LDP. And the reason it's important is because former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who, again, was a prime minister about 4 or 5 years ago, rode to power then on kind of a very nationalistic kind of right-wing position on North Korea. and dealing with North Korean refugees, has now come back in after campaigning that he would kind of rescind some past Japanese apologies and past decisions made by previous governments, and taking a much harder line on issues like Dokdo Takashima or the Senkaku Islands. And so all of a sudden, Japanese politics is much more uncertain and much more sensitive from a Korean perspective. And so there's this vicious cycle feedback loop going on between Seoul and Tokyo right now, which means that Tokyo plays in a way that it was not anticipated to play. A year ago, none of us, we basically wrote off Japan. In fact, interestingly enough, at the conference I attended in Stockholm, there wasn't even a Japanese participant or presenter. It just was considered to be kind of irrelevant. But now it's really much more on the table in a way that it was not. And I'm happy to go into that in greater detail should any of you have specific questions. The next country in terms of direct impact on Korea, ironically, is the U.S. The U.S. is obviously more important than some of the others, but Korea is not an overly partisan issue. It wasn't particularly partisan during the 2008 election between President Obama and McCain. And this election as well, even North Korea, the perennial bogeyman, I looked, there was a campaign surrogate that made a mention last night, but for the last month, I think there's only been 1 or 2 mentions by both campaigns even using the word North Korea. Obviously, there's a lot more focus on the Middle East. Korea is just kind of not on the radar screen, which just means that there's not that much of a change that's likely to come about whether you have a Romney administration or a second term of the Obama administration in terms of how the U.S. deals with Korea. If you kind of take and step back and put Korea-U.S. relations in a longer-term historical perspective, we had some really rough times about 7 or 8 years ago during the Roh Moo-hyun administration, when President Roh Moo-hyun, a very progressive Korean administration, had a counterpart in President Bush, a much more conservative American administration. And this was basically oil and water. And over the intervening decade, or the decade even preceding that, Korea's body politic as a whole had become much more progressive. And the American body politic as a whole had become much more conservative, post 9/11. And almost every issue, the American political establishment, even in the foreign policy, is much more conservative than it was before. And so for the last 4 years, we've had a U.S.-Korea relations that most people describe as the best ever. And part of that reason is because an American liberal president in Obama, in almost every way, is more conservative than a Korean conservative president on North Korea other issues. And so they're really as best matched as you can possibly imagine. So there is some potential that if, and I'll get into this in greater detail when I talk about South Korea, a progressive South Korean candidate wins this December, and Moon Jae-in, and Mitt Romney wins, that you could have somewhat of the same dynamic that we experienced during the Bush administration and the Noh administration. But the reality is that those polls have kind of come much closer together. It's not something I'm deeply worried about. There will be some bumps in the road. More concerning, however, is that if we've had 4 wonderful years that people repeatedly call the best ever, diplomats are wary of this, because if you say the best ever, there's really nowhere to go but down, right? And there's a lot of hard issues coming down the pike that I'll address in a minute or two. So that moves me on then to China. Let's talk about the impact that China might have on Korea today, and more importantly, the specific element that I'm looking at is how political transition in China might impact Korea. China's political transition is the most opaque, of course. We have the 18th Party Congress starting on November 8th. It is widely anticipated that Xi Jinping will take over as the president, and that Li Keqiang will take over as the prime minister. But the normally smooth, carefully orchestrated transition in China has really been bumpy this year. You've had the whole scandal surrounding Bo Xilai, the party secretary from Chongqing, and the very high-profile, embarrassing trial of him and his wife that have kind of forced the party kind of to circle ranks. You've also had an economic slowdown that's kind of affected this. You had, if you were reading the papers, for the last month or so, you had a long period of time, I think for like 19, 20 days, where Xi Jinping just didn't show up, and it was kind of like a Where's Waldo kind of thing, where everybody's trying to find out where Xi Jinping was, and it turns out he had a backache. But in a country where they provide very little information about what's going on, and compared to our democracy, where sometimes I think we have too much transparency, right? We know every meal, what hot dog they ate, and how they thought about it, right? In this case, there was just no information coming out at all. So the political transition in China has been very, very interesting. The reason this is important to Korea is that both in the lead up to it and likely, the months following it, because of the political, I don't want to go so far as to call it instability, but because of political uncertainty inside Beijing, it has really constricted the ability of the government in Beijing to perform in ways that we have expected them to perform. So, for example, for the last year and a half already, China has been much more recalcitrant than normal in dealing with North Korea. And we have expected them to kind of be more cooperative as North Korea has tested nuclear weapons and long-range missiles, et cetera. And instead, because of their own domestic political problems, they've been much more unlikely to kind of move in that direction. That has been something that was furthered by the Arab Spring. As much as we've watched the Arab Spring from Washington, and it is a focus in the presidential debates right now, you can imagine how this is perceived in Beijing. The notion of kind of popular uprisings against unpopular leaders. And on top of that now, you add these questions of the territorial disputes, not only with Japan and on the Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands, but also over the entire South China Seas, where China has taken an increasingly bellicose and nationalistic, stance. The general presumption is that because of this period of political transition, there is less political leeway than you'd normally have. You cannot appear to be weak at this period of time as they're trying to hold things together for the transition. And that's where it really spills most over to Korea, both in Korea-China relations directly, but most directly in terms of the amount of support that China gives to North Korea as you go forward. That leads me to North Korea, a country that has tremendous ability to impact South Korea, and a country that I could go on talking about for an hour or two, because it's immensely amusing. But if I kind of discipline myself and kind of focus on what impact is North Korea likely to have on South Korea, and what impact is the political transition in North Korea likely to have in South Korea, I think I can kind of focus it a little bit. Everybody expected Kim Jong-il to die. We just didn't know when, right? I mean, he was old. He had had a stroke. He had diabetes. There was a lot of trouble that he had gone through, and he lived a hard life, right? Nobody kind of really foresaw the exact day of his reckoning, if you will, December of last year. So everybody put North Korea's political transition at the end of the line, and North Korea kind of jumped to the head of the line, and their political transition took place at the very beginning. And so now we've had a succession which went far faster and far smoother than most people expected. There's been a third generation transition of hereditary transition of power in a communist nation, which those of you who study kind of communism know is anathema to communism as it is. And now we've got this 29, maybe 30-year-old young man, Kim Jong-un, who dresses up in his grandfather's 1950s era Vinalon Mao suits and walks around going like this, and has now decided to do a little bread and circus routine, building dolphinariums and amusement parks and roller coasters in Pyongyang, while the country writ large continues to starve, and the gap between Pyongyang and that grows ever larger. If you look at what's going on in North Korea, for me personally, it's a fascinating time. I mean, watching Kim Jong-il for 12 years was just dreadful. I mean, he's dour, he's always threatening. There was never anything, there's always this sense of menace, and there's something that you could easily ridicule, but it wasn't a lot of fun. Whereas Kim Jong-un is young and energetic, and he's out there, and he actually gives speeches. Kim Jong-il's voice was only heard once by his people, where he said basically, Manse, 10,000 years to his speech for his father. Whereas now Kim Jong-un actually gives public speeches, and he's introduced his wife, something that Kim Jong-il never had done, a young, beautiful woman who's been accompanying him all these site visits and stuff. And so it's fascinating. There's a lot of bling out there. There's a lot of fancy, shiny objects that distract us. But if you step back and look at what are the changes in North Korea's policy, what are their changes towards South Korea, what are their changes in terms of their economy and the prospect for economic reform, what are their changes in terms of their willingness to negotiate seriously on their nuclear weapons program or their long missile program. So far, as much as I'm watching closely, and most people are watching closely, there's not a lot there. So there's a lot less there than meets the eye. So on the one hand, you think North Korea has changed the most because of all the shiny objects. But if you look at the policies and where we stand and how it likely impacts the Korean election, is probably the least in terms of actual direct change. Now, finally, let me move on and talk about South Korea itself, because not surprisingly, the political transition that has the most impact on South Korea is the political transition in South Korea. I shared with the Kennedy Center, and I think you put it up on your Twitter feed or blog or Facebook or something like that, an article I wrote a couple of weeks ago for the Council on Foreign Relations that kind of looked at what's happening in South Korea right now, where you have three main candidates vying for a presidency, where the election will be held in December of this year. There is Park Geun-hye, who is the daughter of the former dictator in South Korea, Park Chung-hee, but who's been a leader of the party for a long time. You have Moon Jae-in, who was a chief of staff under the previous progressive South Korean president, so a much more progressive candidate. And you have Ahn Cheol-soo, a software engineer, very popular, public favorite, kind of outside candidate. And so I made direct comparisons between the Korean elections in 2012 and the American elections in 1992. Because if you look at it, what you have got there is you've got three candidates, kind of an outside third-party candidate, a la Ross Perot, although I think he's a little bit more articulate than Ross Perot in this regard. But they're all coming in together, and they're vying for an electorate which is increasingly centrist. And so, in contrast to our election, where both parties are really just screaming for the polls and becoming much more, vitriolic in their own kind of partisan rhetoric and in their positions, Korea really is a contest for the middle, like the election in 1992 was. If you think back to Bill Clinton, right? He was what they called the blue dog Democrat, who was campaigning on promises of welfare reform. Right? It was a very different kind of election in 1992. You had George H.W. Bush, right, who was, the one president that all conservative Republicans want to forget. So it's a very different era in terms of our politics now and then. But if you look at Korea right now, Park Geun-hye has been campaigning on principles of social justice, economic justice, which are kind of liberal tag words in Korea, promising to kind of move to the middle, try to take over that middle ground. Moon Jae-in has done everything he can to kind of distance himself from the more progressive and more radical policies of his predecessor on the progressive camp. Ahn Cheol-soo seems to be kind of middle of the road on most issues. And so really this is kind of a race for the middle. As for what's going to happen, Professor Larson will answer that question for you, as it turns out. Now, this is really a hard thing. Korean politics, they say a month in Korean politics is a year in our politics. They're very volatile. It's a very relatively small country of 50 million people, but a very plugged-in, hyper-involved political country where polls can change and shift dramatically overnight. So in contrast, again, to our elections, where for all the hoopla that we've seen now in the last week in the presidential debate about, an electorate where you've got basically 47 to 48% to 47 to 48%, and our swing vote is 4 or 5%, and there's a lot of interest in 1 to 2% shifts in polls. In Korea, historically, we've seen the potential for some dramatic shift, 10, even 20% shifts in the polls. So it's really too early to tell. In my book, the organization and the structure of the Park Geun-hye campaign and the way she's comported herself is such that she really has a very good chance of being Korea's first ever, female president. She's remarkable and has kind of positioned herself very well for that. There are some historical legacy issues that make it difficult for her going forward, given the legacy dealing with her father and what he did. But she's begun to address those in a serious way. Moon Jae-in, after coming from a relatively weak position in the Democratic Party in April, has really come back, roaring back, won all the primaries, and is now the undefeated, leader of the Democratic Party in Korea. And the challenge here is that you've now got two relatively progressive candidates in Moon Jae-in and Ahn Cheol-soo who are risking the chance that they might actually split the vote and then give their election to Park, because all of them are polling relatively similar. And so the question is, how is it possible, or is it possible for these two to come to a unified ticket? And what is the process? And this is where I personally am quite confused, because a lot of the focus from the people who are in the Democratic Party is building their institution, strengthening the institution of the party, having gone through, I think, 10 different primaries. If Moon Jae-in were just to abdicate and say, okay, now I'm going to support Ahn Cheol-soo because he's more popular, what does that say about the votes and the process of all those people in your party who supported you that far? So how do you give up your nomination that you've earned? It's a hard thing to do. And so he's been in a position of saying that the only way that Ahn Cheol-soo could ever have his support was if Ahn Cheol-soo came into the Democratic Party. And Ahn Cheol-soo, who has run the entire time as an outsider, not beholden to either of the two parties, has refused to do that. So there's a real kind of train wreck coming down the road, which I honestly don't know how it gets solved, but it's very, very interesting as you're going forward. Regardless of who wins, and again, I'm not, Chicken Little running around thinking that it's going to be a disaster if Moon Jae-in wins. Because the truth is, the progressive candidate in South Korea is far less progressive than his predecessor was. Again, it's this race to the middle again. So any of these three candidates, they're all serious people. They all have considerable degrees of experience. And there's a general agreement on some of the core issues related to the U.S.-ROK alliance. But that said, there's a lot of really difficult issues coming down the pike. And again, it's a bit of a litany, but I'll list some of them just so you know. The challenge of saying that our relationship is the best ever, and it has been the best ever for the last 4 or 5 years, is that a lot of the hard issues have been kind of pushed off. And so the next president in the United States and the next president in South Korea are going to have to deal with North Korea, first and foremost, and coming up with a common policy towards North Korea, implementing some new missile guidelines and the fallout from that. You may have seen the news for the last week where the U.S. and South Korea had a negotiation, agreed to extend the range of South Korean missiles from 500 kilometers to 800 kilometers. And what does that do to Japan? What does that do to China, et cetera? So there's going to be fallout from that. There is a very difficult nuclear cooperation agreement, which has to be negotiated by June, where the U.S. allows Koreans to use U.S. nuclear technology for energy. But that has to be renegotiated, and it's going to be a very tough one coming down the pike. Renegotiation of the transfer of wartime operational control is a possibility depending on who comes in the election. Status of forces agreements, burden sharing in terms of who pays for military things. There's a lot of tough issues coming down the pike. So these are all extremely important issues. Let me end by just giving you one example of the type of programs Mansfield does and that I've been involved in, and then I'll wrap up and we'll open up for question and answers. We started back in 2006 in the worst era of the Nomuhyun Bush administration, kind of the nadir of U.S.-Korea relations, what we call the Mansfield Committee on U.S.-Korea Relations. And I realize that as a BYU alumni and a faithful member of the church that we shouldn't gamble, but this project was really an exercise in picking the horses, right? The idea was to try to figure out which individuals in Korea and which individuals in the U.S. were likely to serve politically in a post-Bush administration and in a post-Nomuhyun administration. So, who has the juice, right? Who has the networks? Who has the drive? Who has positioned themselves well? And so it's a game. You're trying to figure it out. Who's the right person? And so we, because they're both democracies and the election could have gone either way back in 2007 and 2008, we tried to pick, 4 conservatives in Korea, 4 progressives, 4 Democrats, and 4 Republicans, and bring them all together. And in the end, we batted 1,000. It was pure luck, I take all the credit, but it's pure luck, right? We had 5 members of Obama's Asia advisory team as part of our project, and we started our project in 2006. In South Korea, the first national security advisor, the deputy national security advisor, the senior advisor to the foreign minister, and now ambassador to Russia, the first envoy to Washington, and then ambassador to Australia, were all members of our project. And this was 2 years before Lee Myung-bak was elected, right? So we got lucky, right? We picked all the right ones, right? So now we're faced with a very similar situation, right? We're coming up with a transition where at the same time, almost just a month apart, we're going to have either an Obama 2 with new people coming in, or an Romney administration with entirely new people coming in. And we're going to have in Korea, because Korea has a single one-term 5-year presidency, we definitely have got all new people coming in. So we're trying to do the same thing. So over the course of the last year, in several meetings, a January meeting in Maui, in Hawaii, actually the big island of Hawaii, a June meeting in Montana. Remember my correlation between nice places and people's willingness to come? That's the hard part of my job. But we had several meetings where we kind of hammered out among a group of Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and progressives in Korea a series of recommendations where we tried to nail, again, put out very specifically a list of principles for policy coordination in North Korea, a list of 5 things to do in the first 6 months of an administration, a list of 5 things not to do in the first 6 months of administration, a list of things to expect, upcoming events, or things that North Korea might say or do that you should anticipate, and then a calendar of kind of key decision points that are coming down the pike, right? And then, as we are like to do or want to do, we didn't put it on our website, we didn't publish it, we didn't put the big Mansfield logo on it and put it out there and say Mansfield said this. We gave it to everyone we could in the Obama campaign. We gave it to everyone who informed policy in the Romney campaign. And then I went to Seoul at the end of July, and to every one of the leading candidates at that time. We gave it to the key foreign policy people in the campaign and said, take this and use it and make it your own, right? And so the hope is like we did back in 2006 and 2007, where we actually came up with a list of 14 policy recommendations, and by the 6-month point of the Bach administration, 13 of the 14 had been implemented. Now, I can't say that's because of our recommendations, because the truth is the people who made those recommendations were in the administration, right? That was how you were trying to actually directly influence the policy. Now, when I get smart enough that I could come here before you and lay out, in great detail how we'll solve the crisis over the Senkaku Islands or the Tokto Takashima, and how we'll solve the North Korean nuclear problem, and how we'll solve all the other litany of issues that I laid out, then I might actually be deserving of an Alumni Achievement Award. But as today, I'll take it just as an honor. I'm delighted to be here, and we've got about 20 minutes or so for question and answer. So I'd be delighted to kind of go into more depth on any issue that you might be interested in. Thank you so much.
So please just raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll bring a microphone to you, and then tell us your name and what you're studying. So we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Let me ask a quick one while we're waiting for the first question from the audience. Gordon, one of the issues you mentioned, U.S.-South Korean military relations. One of the lingering issues for years has been the Yongsan Army Base in Seoul. Can you give us an update on that situation?
So as you might imagine, there's a lot of deeply intertwined issues surrounding Yongsan. The United States and South Korea have agreed to transfer wartime operational control back to South Korea. Now that may come as a shock to some of you to think, well, didn't South Korea already have wartime operational control, right, of their own army? The thing is, because the United States has a U.S. 4-star general in Korea right now who has many hats. He's the head of the United Nations Command, but he's also head of the U.S. 8th Army in Korea. The U.S., not everywhere, but generally we tend to be quite allergic to putting American soldiers under the command of foreign generals. We've done it within NATO and some other places, and in a smaller level. But in the event of a Korean War contingency, ever since the end of not the end of the war, but rather the truce in 1953, the United States has had wartime operational control. In other words, eventually over the years, we gave back more and more authority and more responsibility to the Republic of Korea Army as their abilities and their capacity increased. And the assumption always was that when the Korea got to the point where they fully defend themselves and the U.S. was not needed, that they would have full wartime operational control of their armies as well. In the No Moon-hyun administration, the No administration took something which was a very good, positive thing to say, yes, Korea has arrived, they've got full control, you're graduating, we're giving it to you. And he took it and turned it into, for his political base, a very nationalistic, we are going to restore our sovereignty, we're going to take back wartime OPCON from the Americans. And the Americans at that time reacted very badly. And if you think of who the Americans were, this was Donald Rumsfeld and the Donald Rumsfeld Pentagon, right? And his response was, you want it? Fine, take it. We're out of here, right? That's paraphrasing. But actually, if you know Donald Rumsfeld, it's not paraphrasing by too much, right? Actually, I would just have to use a lot of words that you don't use at BYU if I really wanted to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld, right? But the reality is, the U.S. decided, well, we're going to push it back. And the Koreans found something that they thought they were pushing against U.S. opposition. They were pushing against an open door. So Rumsfeld had proposed to give it back in 2009. And the Koreans said clearly they didn't want that. They didn't have what they call the C4I, intelligence and lift and all the other capacities that the American forces, U.S. forces, Korea still provide. And so, again, I'm making this too complex, so I thought I'd give a little bit of context. When President Lee Myung-bak came in, one of the first requests he made to President Obama was to delay the date of that transfer from 2012 to 2015. So we've done that, but I guarantee you that issue will come back up again. Next year with the new president, they'll say, well, 2015 is a little bit soon. Can we push it back a little bit further in terms of the timing of that? And so as a result, a lot of the investments that were required moving U.S. forces to Pyeongtaek and the process of doing that have really kind of been gummed up in the works. And so I don't know a date certain. It's still all in process. It's still planned. They're building in an entire new set of bases down in the city of Pyeongtaek where they're going to have housing for families, et cetera. And that eventually will lead to the U.S. to move from Yongsan. And for those of you who don't know, I should have started off with this. Yongsan is the main U.S. base. It's right smack in the middle of Seoul. So it's kind of like if Central Park was a Canadian Army base, right? And well, I shouldn't pick on the Canadians. I couldn't think of somebody else, but an ally. Canadians are allies. It's good. Right in the middle of the city, some extremely valuable real estate. And so it's one of those things where, for public relations, for no other reason, the U.S. is looking to get it out and move. I don't know date certain, but like I say, the process is complicated and it's tied up with the transfer of wartime OPCON. So. Yes, sir, in the far back there.
Hi, I'm Noah Driggs.
Oh, Noah, do you want to get the...
Okay. Hi, I'm Noah Driggs. I'm an international relations major. Could you go into a little more detail on each of the South Korean candidates' positions on North Korea? And also, it seems like the official party line in North Korea is we're not going to change any of our positions towards South Korea. But from what you've seen in their actions, do you foresee any shifts in North Korean policy towards South Korea?
Thanks. One of the reasons why I'm not overly concerned about the impact of the Korean presidential election on North Korea policy is because I don't think North Korea at this time has the capacity to respond to any of them, right? All three candidates, Park Geun-hye, Moon Jae-in, and Ahn Cheol-soo, have been professing to have a more progressive approach to North Korea. Just last week, Moon Jae-in kind of laid out his policy, as did Ahn Cheol-soo, both calling for some type of a peace treaty, a movement forward, but again, both adhering to the demand that North Korea has to denuclearize, both adhering to the notion there has to be some conditionality in this process. Likewise, Park Geun-hye, who's running from a conservative perspective, has really become much more progressive in terms of what they promised to do with North Korea, re-engage. The general narrative has been that during the 5-year presidency of Lee Myung-bak, that he basically shut down relations with North Korea, that there had been this great blossoming and flowering of inter-Korean relations under his predecessor. You may recall in 2000, President Kim Dae-jung had a summit meeting with Kim Jong-il in Pyongyang. He received the Nobel Peace Prize. There was a tourist zone that was set up in the far eastern part of Korea, and as well as an investment zone in the western part of Korea. And although some things are still ongoing, a lot of that was shut down for the last 4 years. And Korean politicians want to blame that on the Lee Myung-bak administration. On top of that, there was the sinking of the Cheonan, the South Korean military corvette, in March of 2010, and the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island, for the first time since the armistice, where the North Koreans actually shelled South Korean land, killing not just soldiers but civilians. Right? Both these are what we would consider an act of war, which we would have responded to. I personally tend to see Lee Myung-bak as a paragon of patience, right? That he's really been quite principled in his approach to North Korea and just has not made it a priority. He said, look, I'm willing to deal with you when you're ready to deal, but I'm not going to bend over backwards. All three candidates right now have promised a more progressive approach to North Korea, but my basic assessment is that North Korea right now is so caught up in their own internal politics and transitions that, absent a South Korean, new president being willing to give away the store with no conditions, which can't happen in South Korea today. I don't see how the North Koreans can accept it. And so I anticipate continued difficulty. In fact, given the gap between expectations and reality, you may have a bit of a backlash in South Korea. In other words, in a nutshell, and I realize I'm making this too long, in a post-Cheonan, sinking of the corvette, post-Yeonpyeong Island shelling Korea, no politician in Korea can give away the store. You can't go back to the policies of 1998, the Sunshine Policy, with investment in cash flows and bribes without conditions. It doesn't work anymore. And that's what North Korea wants. And so I don't anticipate they would respond dramatically. I think we had a question in the far back, yeah.
Ryan Benyon, political science. I had a question about the Senkaku Islands. It's my understanding that the Japanese federal government bought those islands to prevent a more extremely patriotic local government from getting them. Despite the rhetoric coming from the PRC, how much do you think the PRC leadership appreciates what the Japanese national government did, and how bad do you think it would have been if they hadn't stepped in?
Yeah, this is a really complex issue and a very difficult issue, and your question is spot on. There is a small series of islands, islets if you will, that are actually very close to Taiwan, but they are part of that long extended chain of islands that comes down from Okinawa that the Japanese claim, and which, the United States does not take a position on. We don't have a formal government position on the sovereignty of those islands. However, we recognize them in our treaty alliance, in Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, as areas administered by Japan. So if China were to try to take over these islands physically from Japan, we would be obliged to fight with China for those rocks by our treaties, right? Now, ironically, and I'll go into a little bit of history here, just because the historian's here, I was told recently by someone in the State Department that when we originally wrote Article 5 of the treaty, we were focused very much on the Kurile Islands, other disputed islands with Russia. And we were trying to exclude the Kuriles, to say basically we will not go to war with the Soviets over the Kuriles because they are no longer administered by Japan. So by including the words areas administered by Japan in the Article 5 of our treaty, we were trying to say, look, we don't have a position on the Kuriles. That's your all's business, but we're not going to fight over those. But in 2005, and under President Bush and under Secretary Rumsfeld, right, I agree, we made it very clear that since we actually, the U.S., had been administering both Okinawa and the Senkakus until the United States gave Okinawa back to the Japanese in 1971, those were areas administered by Japan, and they fell under the defense treaty, right? Now, China, for a good period of time in the 50s and 60s and 70s, admitted openly and by policy that those were part of Japan. If you look at Chinese maps from that era, they were listed in the same color as Japan. You can find many statements from Mao, et cetera, saying they were Japanese land. But we're in a very different era right now, where the Chinese leadership, not because they are strong, but because they are weak, has very little ability to kind of compromise these things, because through their education systems, and other states in the region have done this as well, they have raised a generation where the younger generation is more nationalistic than the older generation is. Right? And almost every country in the region, that's actually true in that regard, but particularly in China. And so it's very difficult for the Chinese government to show any flexibility or, per your question specifically, understanding on this issue. Now, to make this clear, these were islands administered by Japan, but they were in private ownership, right? So the privately owned land. Ishihara, the mayor of Tokyo, who was a far right-wing anti-China basher, wanted to buy them. Tokyo was going to buy them and build some structures on there and probably a big old sign saying nasty things about China. Who knows, right? If that had happened, it would have been horrible, right? And so in an effort to kind of head that off, right, the national government of Korea, of Japan, under Prime Minister Noda, essentially nationalized the islands. They said, look, we're not going to let the mayor of Tokyo buy this and taunt China. We will buy it. Well, for China, however, this is upsetting the status quo, right? Because as long as they were unowned, uninhabited, it was just a debate about things, it was okay. But by the national government buying it, it raised the profile in such a way that even if they did understand the nuance that you've laid out, publicly there's no way they could do anything other than what they've done, which is really go completely off the reservation, right? A lot of yelling and screaming and burning Japanese cars and torching things. And in the last month alone, there's been a drop in 40,000 seats in ANA flights alone to Beijing. It's really hitting at a very difficult time in China-Japan relations. But very, very insightful question. Thank you. There was a question. I'm sorry, are we running out of
I think
time?
we'll take one more, and then
All right.
we're out of time.
Yes. We got the microphone coming over here.
Who is it?
Yes, sir.
I'm Jordan Hamzawi, International Relations and Japanese major. So with and I forget the Korean word, the Takashima Islands, it seems that, with all the dispute between South Korea and Japan, that really underlying that is, tensions that remain from World War II and from those atrocities. And, I'm just curious what your opinion is. What would be the first steps for each country to, really finally bury the hatchet, between these things, because they keep coming up in basically any international relations between the two. What can the two countries do to start to alleviate that?
So there are a lot of unresolved historical legacy issues in Northeast Asia. I mean, a lot. And so it's not just these two sets of islands, but there's issues surrounding in terms of Japan's recognition of the comfort women, which is a very almost offensively euphemistic term for what Secretary Clinton now I think is calling sex slaves in that regard. And their failure to fully come to grips with that is going forward. I'm of the mind, personally, that these difficult, sensitive, nationalistic historical legacy issues are like potholes, right? That you don't ever try to hit a pothole head on, right? Because you're just going to make it worse. I don't know that you can bring these issues to a head and then solve them. Because they're so tied into the domestic politics in each country and senses of right and wrong and legacy and historical nationalistic kind of things. So really what you've got to do is you've got to try to fill them in as much as possible, strengthen the roadway either around it, a detour, build improve the shocks on your own car so that when you do hit it, that you'll be able to weather it better. And so my general recommendation is really try to strengthen other areas of Korea-Japan cooperation so that whenever these issues do come up, they don't become the preeminent issue in the relationship, right? Unfortunately, we've had a really bad spell this last year. At the end of 2010, Korea-Japan relations were probably the best ever. Because you had Korean observers at a U.S. ROK joint naval exercise, Japanese observers, no, other way around. Korean observers at a joint U.S.-Japan naval exercise, and vice versa. You had Japanese strong support for Korea after the sinking of the Cheonan and the Cheonan-Yeonpyeong. And then you had the horrible events of March 11th with the tsunami, and the Koreans were the first to have things on the ground. Massive generators, massive cash influence. The Korean wave, this Hallyu with the Bae-yeon-jun and all these dramas and stuff was really big in Japan. Yon-sama, Bae-yeon-jun actually gave $1 million of his own money to Japan. And things were really going good. And then, unbeknownst to most Japanese, and this is actually something I learned here in this room at the Kennedy Center. I came back from Korea, with a very Korean sense of history in Northeast Asia, right? Because I learned my history at the Dongnip Kinyumgwan, the National Independence Museum, which is a 7-building anti-Japanese propaganda museum is what it is, right? And that's where I learned it. And what I learned was, that here I had a much more nuanced sense of realizing that, when you talk about Japan as a unitary actor and as a whole, you miss something, right? You miss the debates and the different factions and what's going on there. But, the perception in Korea was that right after the events of 9/11, when Japan's foreign ministry issued a statement about Takashima, that how could Japan do this to us? We've been helpful, we're giving them aid, and they slapped us in the face and did that, and that was just this national sense of outrage and betrayal by the Koreans. But I would bet 99% of Japanese never even knew about that statement. Why would they? They're in the middle of a national crisis, dealing with a nuclear crisis and a tsunami and 19,000 dead. They didn't even know what happened. And so the Koreans as a whole are offended by what they think Japan as a whole did, but Japan doesn't know they did it. And then that led to crisis over this, sharing a military intelligence agreement, which kind of blew up in the face of both parties in Korea. And it led to the president going to visit, Takashima or Dokdo and really raise the profile. The last thing I'll add here, and I realize I'm going on long here, is that a program that the Mansfield Foundation did in May of last year was one that looked at the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, right? That's something I think is an embarrassment and a shame that the United States doesn't ratify, right? It actually provides mutually agreed upon definitions of what an island, what a continental shelf is, what you get out of it. It provides a mechanism for resolving a lot of these disputes, but the United States is not part of it. And it's kind of stuck in our Senate right now. But we did a conference on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and looking at that dynamic. Obviously, I have my own biases. I won't share them right now in terms of solve, but I don't think taking it head-to-head in that type of a venue is going to be likely to solve it as much as I'd like it to. So forgive me. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much.